Grazie Igor, grazie a tutti gli organizzatori, Don Mauro, Simona e Raffaele anche. Due cose, io parlerò finalmente non in francese ma in inglese perché ho visto che sarebbe forse più intelligibile per gli altri partecipanti. E dopo vado a tentare di condividere la scherma adesso per poter seguire. Funziona bene così?
Sì.
Sì? A posto.
Sì.
Perfetto.
Ok, quindi second scholasticism as history of philosophy. Cos'è la seconda scolastica? I decided today to answer this question by taking seriously the epithet second we attribute to this particular tradition, following a usage, as you know, probably largely inherited from the great Paduan Jesuit Carlo Giaccon. The early moderns themselves rather considered themselves as scholastici novi, recenti, or moderni, as we shall see. I will argue that among its many properly rational achievements, second scholasticism can be distinguished from first scholasticism by the fact that it included a form of historical self-consciousness, largely lacking in first scholasticism. Medieval scholasticism, when they commented, for instance, on Aristotle, did not specifically consider themselves as adding something to the text, but as expressing an atemporal truth. Early modern scholastics, on the contrary, consciously argued that scholastic activity could create new concepts and discover new problems unknown to the ancient authors. We may recall here a very famous quote by Leibniz in the foreword of his Theodicy. For sundry dogmas, such as those of physical predetermination, middle knowledge, philosophical sin, objective precisions, and many other dogmas in speculative theology and even in the practical theology of cases of conscience, came into currency after the Council of Trent. I'm underlining the after. A recent collection of essays directed by Ulrich Lehner from Notre Dame University, Innovation in Early Modern Catholicism, has been precisely published on this topic, looking at many innovations in various fields of knowledge, very similar to those that we are addressing in this Congress. My own perspective today will be more general. I will not try to look at one specific innovation, but I would like to propose an interpretation of Catholic second scholasticism as the first history of medieval philosophy. Why stressing here the Catholic side of scholasticism? Well, not for confessional reasons, but for precisely strictly historiographical ones. Why? Because the standard historiographical stance is that it was precisely Reformed or Protestant scholasticism that was at the root of our contemporary practice of history of philosophy, because that tradition produced the first global histories of philosophy, such as Johann Jakob Brucker's famous history published in 1741. A tradition closely linked to the University of Jena in Germany, where later Hegel would transform history of philosophy into a full-blown philosophy of history. If we look at what remains the best history of the histories of philosophy, an Italian production under the direction of Padua professors Giovanni Santinello and Gregorio Piaia, we can only be impressed by the fact that the prism, especially of the first volume, was almost 90% German and Protestant. 10% or even less were dedicated to a couple of Catholic authors, but only to mention the rather trivial doxographic approach of Jesuits such as Francisco de Toledo and Pereira when they speak about ancient philosophers. It was a bit better in volume 2, where, however, not a single scholastic author from the Catholic tradition is mentioned, just a few more outsiders, such as Jean de Launois' History of Aristotelianism at the Sorbonne. In the third volume, finally, some more elements are given about the historiographical achievements of the Catholic Enlightenment, to which I shall go back myself at the end of this talk. So the standard assumption has long been the following. It is commonly accepted, since the numerous studies of the 1930s by Petersen and Eschweiler in Germany, that the Protestant Schulmetaphysicians highly praised the Catholic scholastics and had precisely seen their intellectual potential in explaining in new ways the realm of nature and the realm of grace. This is why we find these long lists of Spanish, Italian, or globally Latin authors in many of the Protestant works, for instance, here in Richard Baxter's Theology, an English Nonconformist Divine, and in Jena, Valentin Wertheim famously defended Discourse de Laudibus Scholasticorum, which was reproduced partially by Pufendorf. By distinguishing the Neoterici from their medieval counterparts, Protestant authors, and especially the eclectic school of Jena, could, from that point of view, legitimately be seen as the inventor of a reflexive history of philosophy, from which a direct line would then lead to the first 19th century modern histories of medieval philosophy, such as Wilhelm Telemann, for instance. Now, what I would like to do today is challenge this view and look at the specific contribution Catholic second scholasticism made to the construction of a history of philosophy, and to look at second scholasticism as a sort of culmination point of an endogenous history of philosophy. I think, and I will argue, that these authors were clearly conscious of constituting a new moment in the long history of scholastic method, whose history has been yesterday brilliantly recalled by Pasquale Porro. I will substantiate this argument by making two claims. First claim, second scholasticism has a cumulative conception of history. This means that it does not see itself as a breakaway from previous forms of scholasticism, unlike what is suggested in the Protestant Historia Philosophica, but rather as its continuation. This is an argument leveled against the classical decline and fall or decadent thesis, namely the argument that the scholastic tradition came to a close and that it was actually a good thing that it came to a close. My second claim today is that second scholasticism has what I will call an integrative view of knowledge, and thereby defines itself not just as a practice of rational argumentation, as Pasquale has shown yesterday, but as a progressive moment capable of submitting new discoveries in the field of philosophy and theology to its very own proper method. With the exception of some of its most reactionary forms, second scholasticism did not consider itself as a reenactment of the Middle Ages, but as a history of the Middle Ages and a continuous refinement, integrating continuously new elements from the outside. This argument is basically leveled against another classical thesis, which is the divide narrative, the idea that there is such a thing as a big divide between humanism and scholasticism, or between scholasticism and modern science. I believe that both of these claims are strongly opposed to the standard reconstruction of scholasticism, which had been produced by the Protestant writers, and which has actually been also adopted by a number of Catholic writers, in particular in the French Jansenist tradition, and in the traditions that were influenced by the French Jansenism, including in Italy, actually. As the late and regretted Riccardo Quinto, to whom I would like to dedicate this talk, has shown in his beautiful book Scolastica, the origin of this view, if we look at a chronology, can be found in the work of a rather forgotten French Calvinist active in Geneva, Lambert Dannot, who in his sentence commentary, very rare case of a Protestant sentence commentary, has produced a history, a very influential history of scholastic method. Danot divided scholasticism into three periods, as you may know: Old Scholasticism, Middle Scholasticism, and New Scholasticism. Globally, the authors that were limiting them were Lanfranc from Pavia to Albert the Great to Durandus, and then Durandus to 1514. It's very precise. You will have recognized the beginning of the preaching of Luther. This tripartite rhythm is understood according to a model of growth and decadence. The beginning gives rise to a golden age, and then the last part is just decadence and fall. Adjectives used by Danot to describe the Nova Scolastica are unambiguous: ultima, pessima, imprudentissima. Because this scholasticism, full of subtleties and distinction, leads to doubt the words of the gospel. This model was extremely popular in Protestant circles, and in the middle of the 18th century, actually Jakob Brucker used basically exactly the same model, and shares also the very negative opinion about the Scholastica Nova, in which he blames in particular the pernicious influence of Duns Scotus, who has driven scholastic insanity to previously unknown levels. What is less known is that this Protestant model has actually been also adopted by a number of anti-scholastic Catholic writers of the 17th and 18th century. It was the case, as I said, of Jansenists in France, Louis-Élie Dupin, for instance, and Claude Fleury in his ecclesiastical history, who was desperate about what is called les sophismes de la scolastique moderne. And more surprisingly, we find it in the very influential work of a French Jesuit, René Rapin, from the Collège Louis le Grand, one of the promoters of history of modern philosophy, who uses exactly the same tripartite model in his Réflexions sur la philosophie ancienne et moderne, to which he added not, of course, a celebration of Luther, but of the new philosophers Descartes and Gassendi. The self-understanding of Catholic second scholastic writers was a clear rejection of this narrative, based on the two claims I just made earlier. First, there is no such thing as a narrative of decadence. Second, there is no such thing as a break with modern philosophy. Their conception was thus both cumulative and integrative. Their implicit idea was that each generation of scholastics did better than the previous ones. Among most second scholastic schools, the tripartite model of decline, apex and fall, was therefore replaced by a bipartite model of Scholastica Antiqua and Recens. I give you one example taken from a Spanish Jesuit, Gabriel de Henao, who tried to write a sort of history of the medieval and early modern problem applied to divine foreknowledge, the famous Scientia Media hypothesis by Molina. Henao clearly divides the traditions in veteres scholastici, and he goes up to the 15th and early 16th century, and recentiores scholastici, recent scholastics. The adjectives used again are important. The veteres are solidi, they're sound and solid. The new ones are ingegnosi, gravissimi. Recent authors, he says, propose an emendation of the older ones, and not only as a repetition. So initially, this tradition looks at itself as a cumulative tradition, and this explains clearly the image of the Peripateticus in this French academic engraving, which I used as a title page, where you see Aristotle, Averroes, Avicenna, and then Oviedo, Fonseca, Arriaga, and Suarez as a sort of cumulative series of books. What were the arguments for this attitude? I think one can identify two major lines of arguments, one having to do with the objects of thought and the other with the method of the scholastics themselves. The first argument is objective. It corresponds to the idea that the human mind is continuously discovering new entities, new facts, or events unknown to previous generations. Things Aquinas ignored were known in the 16th century, were unknown, sorry, or were discovered in the 16th century. Only so could so many new concepts emerge during second scholasticism. This was Gabriel de Henau's argument in his Scientia Media Historica Propugnata. And it is, of course, also easy to understand in the field of natural philosophy, in the field of patristics, in the field of colonial discoveries. What was valid in Europe is not valid anymore in America, wrote famously Vieira, prompting his contemporaries to revise a certain number of their assumptions, for instance, on the topic of the natural knowledge of God. But it actually even applies to the Christian message itself. Many things that belong to theology are not in the Bible, wrote famously John Mayer at the turn of the 16th century. Because Christianity is a historical revelation, because the councils and the popes define new limits to the faith on a continuous basis, we need to acknowledge that scholasticism evolves. A beautiful text is the preface of Rodrigo de Arriaga's course of philosophy. You should not fear the novelty of opinions and reject them just because they are new. Remember that there was a day when the doctrine of the Christian religion itself was a great novelty, and that does not make it less true. Human intelligence, ingenium, did not stop with Plato and Aristotle, neither has it been interrupted by the hand of the Lord. And there was as much, if not more, intelligence in Aquinas, Cajetan, Molina, Suarez, and so many others. The second set of argument is more subjective and has to do with the historical situation of the scholastics themselves. We are not just dwarves on the shoulders of giants, to use an image that was very popular at all moments that claimed themselves a renaissance, from the school of Chartres to Italian humanism. On the contrary, authors of the past might well appear not as dwarves, but at least as being dwarfed on specific topics. What Scotus left unresolved, said for instance Caramuel, needs to be resolved by his followers. The same goes for other authors. Obscure passages in Aquinas need to be clarified by the later generations. These two lines of argument have been perfectly summarized by a French Jesuit of the 17th century, Jean Martineau, in his posthumous theology. Interestingly, he closely related it to the practice of probabilism. Let's take the case of two equally probable opinions, an old one and a new one. Martineau argues we should actually go for the newest one, since there is a chance that it includes a progress. Let me quote the text in full, since it summarizes the two lines of arguments. Among theologians who disagree about the probability of opinions, one should rather follow the recent writer once they have been properly appreciated, rather than the older ones. There are three reasons for this. First, because there is a number of new things that are defined by the church on a daily basis, quotidian, things that were plainly unknown to the ancient, as we can see it in the case of numerous papal decrees. Interesting for our contemporary period as well. I mean, the papacy adds new things that scholasticism has then to think of. Second, because every day new questions and difficulties appear which were not solved by the ancients. Third, because educated and ascertained recent authors see many more things than the ancients. Not only do they see all what the ancients had written, but also what had been added to them by the recent authors. Basically, we have much bigger libraries. As a result, most of the individual scholastic traditions started constructing their own internal histories, with a list of their achievements over the centuries and the different ways they're related to their foundational texts. Let me just give two examples. One, which is very familiar to Igor Agostini, which is, for instance, the famous Biblioteca by the Venetian from Venice, Xante Mariales, a fantastic, absolutely fantastic history of Thomism, basically, and where he critically asks who could count as a Thomist in the Middle Ages, who is a Thomist in the Renaissance, and what is the proper Thomist tradition in the period since basically Victoria. Second example is the case of the history of the nominalist tradition written by a very strange French author, Jean Salabert, who basically tried to relate Abélard, Occam until the late Parisian nominalist of the late Middle Ages. Let me go towards the end now. I'm arguing that second scholasticism's view of the history of medieval philosophy was both cumulative and integrative. As such, it had clearly a historicist self-definition. To conclude my contribution, I would like now to show you that this attitude has actually led to a general revision of the classical tripartite model among a number of authors of the 18th century. During this period, when scholasticism was under attack by the Enlightenment philosophy, several apologies of scholastic method were produced, of which I shall mention only one here, which is not very famous, the Scolastica Vindicata seu Dissertatio Historico-Cronologico-Critico-Apologetica by a Catalan Jesuit, Joan Battista Gener, who sought refuge in Italy, in Genova, after the expulsion from Spain. In the preface of his work, he clearly advocates a continuistic conception of scholasticism. It contains a long list of all the scholastic, but divided now into new categories. Jenner frontally attacked the received distinction inherited from Dano and say they are incongrua et anachronistica. Incongrua because, in terms of method, Dano did not realize that actually both Lombardus and Durandus all used the sentence commentary. Anachronistic because it did not take into account the most important element to divide the epochs of scholasticism according to Jenner, namely their capacity to integrate elements from outside the scholastic tradition. He therefore proposes the following tripartition. The old scholastics, which are based on the sentence commentaries and that go up to the moment when the Summa and the questions replace teaching at the universities, and he mentions Francisco de Vitoria. The second tradition, which is the recent scholasticism, just as in the traditional Jesuit tradition. And finally, what I could translate as super new scholasticism, the Scholastica Novissima, which corresponds to the 18th century. Super new scholasticism is precisely that tradition which fully integrated the novelties of the age into the courses of philosophy ad seculi gustum et genium. The birth of scholasticism in the 11th century could even look for him like something like a new calendar, like a new hijra, from which we could renumber our centuries. So he writes, and this is my last quote, "We have now reached the 6th century of scholasticism." Quasi finito. Due parole. Last quote. "We have now reached the 6th century of scholasticism, the 17th after the death of Christ. This corresponds to the years 1601, 1700. It was perhaps the most flourishing ever for scholastic theology, be it because the sheer number of works, their ingenuity, their deepness, the profusion of schools all over the world, and their splendor, foremost in Spain, and because of a number of the most famous controversies the human mind can remember, such as those on grace in Rome." Thank you very much.
Grazie, professor SCHMUTZ.